100 million people, the housing supply has more than doubled. More than 77% of the housing stock of towns in the country is made up of homes built in those years, and they've mostly been equipped with all modern conveniences. In accordance with the general purposes of developed socialist society, the major tasks of Soviet urban construction have been as follows: the gradual formation of the new socialist system of dispersion of population, ensuring a relatively even distribution of population over the territory of our country in the most favorable conditions for favorable climatic and natural conditions for life, the construction of new and gradual transformation of all existing populated points of the country into rationally organized settlements, which would create the necessary favorable conditions for work, life, leisure, and comprehensive intellectual and physical development of the population, the preservation and further development of natural resources necessary for the life of mankind. The Soviet economy creates all necessary conditions for the performance of these tasks and is ensuring broad possibilities for the projecting, construction, and management of the development of towns and populated points in the interests of society and its members. In accordance with the laid down social and economic tasks, instruments of such management are the general plan for the population distribution of our country, projects of regional planning for the territory of the country, and also general plans for towns and populated points, and plans for the development of the national economy. The system of population dispersal formed in the course of urban planning and construction has gradually been converted into a highly developed galaxy of grouped constellations of populated points located in various regions of the country on the basis of the creation of new and the development of existing economic enterprises. Gradually, we are performing the tasks we face in all areas of installing equal levels of amenity, public services, transport, utilities, and modern conveniences, something which makes possible the planned performance of the major tasks of Soviet urban construction, and also solutions to such an important social problem as abolishing the distinctions between urban and rural settlements. Projects for regional planning and general plans for populated points have been worked out for implementation over 25-30 years on the basis of the prospects for social and scientific and technological progress. And this is a firm basis for comprehensive and proportionate development of towns and regions. These documents lay down the planned structure of settlements, the system of functional zoning, services, transport, utilities, water, green areas, and conveniences. At the present time, modern general plans have been provided for 98% of towns and more than 70% of urban-type settlements, and also central settlements for state farms and collective farms. The preservation of the urban and natural environment and the creation of the most hygienic conditions of life in settlements in the U.S.S.R. has been provided for by a broad program of measures for the prevention of the pollution of the atmosphere, water, soil, and also the more rational use of natural resources, provided for by a number of decrees of the Supreme Soviet of our country. An important social task laid down by the Soviet state is the ensuring to each family of an individual apartment with modern convenience. As a result of the implementation of the program of civilian housing construction, in the last 5 years alone, every newly built apartment has been given to an individual family. As of the beginning of 1976, already 72% of the families of our country living in towns have their own individual apartments. As the economic resources of the country grows, there is a systematic growth in the standard of housing. For example, in recent years, this standard has changed 3 times, 57, 64, and 69. At the present time, work is going on, and has been concluded, in fact, on preparation for an entirely new standard, which will be introduced experimentally after 1981. The bulk of the housing construction in our country, 70% of it, is conducted through state resources and the resources of public organizations with free provision of apartments to workers. Housing construction cooperatives are responsible for 5.4 of the volume of building. The rest urban construction programs in the U.S.S.R. are an indispensable element of long-term 5-year and 1-year development economic plans of the U.S.S.R. and are therefore backed by all necessary resources of the state. The state organization for urban construction is a reliable basis for purposive development and is regulated by government organs of the U.S.S.R. and the constituent republics. Urban construction in the U.S.S.R. is carried on the basis of broad scientific research. There have been created and are in operation a system of central and zonal, depending on the region of the country, scientific research institutes for model and pilot projects. Plans for scientific research and project work embrace also long-term and current problems in the field of urban planning and civilian housing construction, taking into account the natural, climatic, and national practices and specific features of different areas of the country. Urban construction programs are carried out by powerful state construction organizations. Industrialization and assembly line organization of building has ensured high rates of building economy and economies of scale in housing construction. A major tendency in the development of the mass housing construction in the U.S.S.R. is prefabrication and large component construction. The U.S.S.R. has 413 house construction plants at work, and on the average, prefabricated dwellings constituted 50% of the construction, and in certain towns amounted to 90% of the construction. There's broad development in the industry for building materials, for the training of architects and building experts and qualified building workers. We have in our country 136 architectural and building institutes and 525 middle-level institutions. Altogether, more than 1,500 professional institutions. All this is a reliable basis for carrying out plans determined by the policy and strategy of the development and transformation of the populated points of the country. The 25th Congress of the Communist Party of the U.S.S.R., which took place at the beginning of this year, laid down further program for enhancing the comfort and convenience of buildings and the development of towns and in villages, and also provided for improving their infrastructure and the developing of the output and material technological basis for building scientific and project organization. The experience of our country enables us to draw conclusions about the major orientations for national policy and national action, and also with regard to what could be done to perform the tasks before us more successfully. Fundamentally, in our view, they are correctly set forth in the documents which have been prepared, which could, after the necessary votes in the committee, be adopted, and after we've done some work on improving their individual aspects. In each country, in our view, it's necessary to create the organs for state management, ensuring the preparation and implementation of national policies and strategies in the field of construction and settlement. Also, we must ensure the necessary state planning of urban construction and the development of long-term and current plans geared with national resources. We should also ensure the training of national experts in urban construction, architects, engineers, and qualified building experts, both by means of creation of regional and national higher and middle level teaching institutes, and also by means of training specialists in schools operating abroad. We should also ensure the creation and development of national scientific project and construction organizations, and also the building materials industry, in order to ensure the possibility of rational and unhindered implementation of urban construction programs. We should be able to eliminate or prevent speculation in land necessary for the development of populated centers, and for this purpose it would be a good idea to nationalize this land or have it acquired by national organs. International cooperation in the field of settlements, in our view, should be directed to the granting of consultative, advisory, technological, and other forms of assistance in the production and implementation of the above-mentioned aspects of national policy and strategy. This assistance should be conducted both on a multilateral and bilateral basis. The Soviet Union, like many other countries, is not entirely satisfied with the work of the New York Housing, Building and Planning Center. I say this in connection with the circulated alternative documents with regard to the organizational activity of the center. However, we think that the situation should be improved by means of creating a new, not by creating a new body, but rather by means of appropriate organizational strengthening, restructuring of this already existing and operating organ with the purposes of stepping up coordination of efforts of various parts of the United Nations. We support also the proposal of the Preparatory Committee to strengthen and intensify the work of regional organs on the model of existing European organizations, for example. It seems to us that we should considerably expand international cooperation and exchange, both on a regional and also on a bilateral basis. The experience in carrying out complex programs of integration in the field of urban construction carried out within the framework of the Council for Mutual Economic Cooperation, the work of the European Committee on Housing within the framework of the European Economic Commission of the United Nations, and also the developing cooperation of our country in the field of housing with Canada, the United States, and a number of Western European countries, all testify to the great significance of this work for the peoples of our countries and other countries, regardless of their political and social and economic systems. Ladies and gentlemen, in order radically to solve the problems we're discussing, we need tremendous resources and tremendous efforts, primarily at the national level. These resources exist, as a rule, in the overwhelming majority of countries. However, they are by no means being used in the interests of solving the most important problem of the times, the problem we've met here to discuss. There's an unjust distribution of national income, war, and the incessant arms race, competition to create systems of incredible destructive power, which absorb resources of states. All this is prejudicial to the solution of the problems we've come here to discuss. The Soviet Union has repeatedly been the initiator of disarmament programs, and the idea of diverting resources of the countries of the world to the creation of the best possible conditions for life and existence of the peoples of the earth. This is something which is dictated by reason and justice. We believe that our conference, which is seeking ways and means of solving the urgent problems and needs of mankind in the field of housing and settlements, should not pass over in silence this aspect of world policy either. The resources of nations which are unproductively spent on armaments should, on the basis of agreements to reduce armaments, should be devoted to the solution of the housing problem and the many problems of human settlements. Thank you.
Game time. Yes. I wish to thank the chairman of the State Committee for Construction and Architecture of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The next speaker is the Undersecretary General of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations, Mr. Gabriel Van Leetem, to whom I now give the floor.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, in a cycle of major world conferences, which are perhaps transient but certainly highly significant expressions of international activity, the present conference on human settlements is of particular importance. With the exception of subsistence, there is no more essential concern for all human beings than the settings in which they live. It is the sign of their integration into the community, the condition for their personal and family balance, and the token of their dignity or despair. This major event has a dual origin. First, the awareness of environmental problems, but this conference is even more within the wake of the 6th and 7th special sessions of the General Assembly, which proclaimed the principle and formulated the plan for a new international economic order. This plan, of course, has its inspiration and purpose not only in the advancement of individuals and the improvement of their living conditions and relations among themselves, that is its social content, action relating to habitat and human settlements, and the progress of towns and rural areas, which is the objective of that action, is encompassed by that plan. But as has been emphasized, such action depends primarily on the initiative and authority of each government. We must therefore cautiously and realistically explore the possibilities for action in this field by the United Nations. That approach is, moreover, essential if we want the necessarily limited means available to the organization to be used to the best advantage and to have the stimulating or catalytic effect expected. In preparing this conference, the United Nations drew up an inventory. Several units of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, particularly the Center for Housing, Building and Planning, were closely associated with that work. I should like to draw 3 conclusions from that inventory. The first is the inadequacy of our knowledge, especially as concerns developing countries, many of which are still ill-equipped to observe and measure exactly the living conditions of their populations. The survey submitted to you covers only 60% of all dwellings. The remaining 40%, situated almost entirely in developing countries, could be evaluated only by sampling. That finding, as is often the case in this type of worldwide undertaking, will probably give many governments an opportunity to improve their observation tools which are necessary for policy formulation. The second conclusion, which awakens our consciences and should mobilize our determination, and which is unavoidable despite the inadequacy of our data, is that a considerable and perhaps growing part of mankind lives in wretched conditions. Running water and sanitary facilities are still a privilege of which most families are deprived. That privilege is unequally distributed both among countries and within each country. The same is true of medical care, educational infrastructure, and employment opportunities. The hope, but alas, often only the hope, brings the rural peoples to the least advantaged districts of the cities of the Third World. The growth of these cities has resulted partly from the flight from the countryside and partly from the natural increase of a young population. It attains proportions which are difficult to imagine, since it has been calculated that in Africa, if the current trend continues, the urban population will increase from 30 to 300 million inhabitants between 1950 and the year 2000. Even a serious effort to halt this influx of rural people into the towns by creating jobs where they live and developing rural areas will not allow us to evade the problems of the gigantic cities which are coming into existence in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The organization of these cities and the employment of their inhabitants may become a major challenge for governments of developing countries in the coming years, and one of the most difficult to solve. In the case of housing alone, the scope of that challenge becomes apparent when one realizes that in order to meet foreseeable needs for the last quarter of the century, a number of dwellings equal to that already existing in all the countries of the world will have to be built between now and the year 2000. The traditional economic mechanisms may prove incapable of solving the problems raised by these urban masses. The traditional sources of finance to which poor municipalities can have recourse may prove inadequate for the establishment of the infrastructure, and the income of the inhabitants too low to cover housing costs. How are these obstacles to be overcome, and where are the means of action to be found? First, no doubt, within the populations concerned themselves, by mobilizing their energy struggle against real estate speculation and the exploitation of poverty, and a simultaneous effort to seek greater economic and social justice. Statistics and analysis thus lead to a third conclusion, namely that a significant and lasting improvement in the habitat of mankind can only be achieved by the economic and social progress of the community. The aim is not to eliminate slums as such, but I shall abide by your ruling and request delegates to read the remainder of my text, which refers to institutional problems on which my department wished to state its opinions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Undersecretary General of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations. The last speaker this morning is the Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, Mr. Bradford Morse.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates. I regard it as a very special privilege to join you today because I believe that this conference and the results it will achieve will have a dramatic effect on the lives of millions of people with whom we share this planet. I shall, in the time which you have so generously made available to me, share with you some thoughts about wider perspectives, better planning approaches, and innovations in design and cost that I believe we must achieve to improve the entire development process and human settlements as a vital component of that process. We must do better, and we can do better for the deprived millions who live each day on the margin of survival. We must re-examine our aging assumptions about technical cooperation, assumptions that are safe and defensible, but which are no longer adequate if we are to achieve effective change. We need to identify our earlier mistakes, whether in the design of programs and projects with mushrooming costs, or in the creation of new mechanisms simply because they provide an easier answer to conflicting pressures. The knowledge and experience which you have brought with you can promote, as no earlier venture has, better lives for those who this day are threatened by forces which can be resisted only by the unwavering dedication of us all. It is already a platitude, though still imperfectly understood and all too infrequently acted upon, that development needs which were once seen as sectoral have profound and pervasive multi-sectoral implications. We have come to know how true this is in the United Nations Development Program's extensive work relating to human settlements. The UNDP-supported project to prepare an overall scheme for the long-range growth of Karachi brought together both Pakistani and international experts skilled in statistics, economics, sociology, in finance, law, and urban design, in housing and community development, in municipal and transport engineering, and regional planning. Our program to help improve conditions in the rural communities of the Andes Mountains call for the combined efforts of a number of countries, 7 different United Nations agencies, half a dozen different bilateral programs, and numerous non-governmental organizations. Their work included the development of agriculture, animal husbandry, small industries and cottage crafts, workers' cooperatives, and the improvement of housing, health, vocational training, educational and administrative services, and the institution of agrarian reform and land settlement programs. This experience suggests that the nation's undertaking to meet the pledges proposed in your draft declaration will have to plan comprehensively for land ownership, land use alternatives, and all the other subtly interacting development needs and proposals. And the process will have effects beyond national boundaries. Trading prospects with other nations may vitally affect the growth potential of cities, towns, and not least, commodity-producing rural communities. The programs this conference is examining are intimately linked to the search for a new international economic order and its planning requirements within each country. Human settlements will be brought into clear relief by this historic conference as another of the fundamental fields of development, systemic within all development, affected by all and affecting all. It will thus join other critical needs and essential processes identified at other world conferences concerned with other forces which affect the human condition, the environment, population, food, the integration of women, employment, and trade and development. Common to all of these is the proposition that their requirements are not fully met by mounting larger number of separate projects under separate classifications, but their requirements in many crucial respects can be met only through the strategy of overall national plans and within the designs of many other types of projects. At both the national and international levels, this in turn poses urgent institutional questions. Human settlements planning is an essential ingredient of overall development and planning and programming. We must assure that arrangements for dealing with this important subject are harmonized with all other elements of the United Nations development system and avoid the ever-present danger of fragmentation. We need now to consolidate all the heightened perceptions of the integrated development process that we have come to understand and accept in recent years. We need to regard all the functions and the interactions of the development process as one systemic whole. One of the traditional assumptions of development which demands re-examination is that urbanization and the concentration of industry and commerce in urban areas are not only inevitable, but indeed essential for national development. This assumption encouraged an indifference toward the growth of slums and shanty towns, and that indifference has lost us precious years which we can never regain. It is not an issue of industrialization versus agriculture, about which the developing countries have every justification to be acutely sensitive. The issue is whether there is a preordained pattern to crush human beings into a few hundred giant cities, and whether almost all industry must be concentrated with them there in order for a nation to achieve significant and continuing economic growth and its just share of the wealth of the planet. To raise the question, it seems to me, is to provide the answer. But before the sun sets tonight, thousands of hopeful men and women will have moved down the roads and across the bridges to cities and towns that cannot shelter them, much less employ them and enrich their lives. Let us seek new ways to create a mutual magnetism between town and village so that a new bridge need not result in the march of the brightest and the bravest from the villages to the slums with waste and debilitation as the only rewards. But this can be achieved only if life in the villages can be made more satisfying in every respect, and the legitimate aspirations to a life of dignity and self-reliance can be fulfilled. You can help all of us toward a more democratic development process with true human insights and enlarged popular participation. We must listen to each other. We must always ask, has the human equation been adequately examined in this project? We must be sure that the interests, the needs, and the aspirations of the people affected, as they perceive them, have been fully taken into account and respected. This is the ultimate test, for neglect in this regard will guarantee failure. The costs of housing development alone on the scale now needed are such that there will be a premium on cost-effective economies, appropriate technology, and national and local self-reliance in human settlements development. These are guiding principles in the new dimensions of the United Nations Development Program. We in UNDP are determined to reduce the unit costs, both of local and national development, and of external cooperation in order that program delivery will not be eroded. Building research centers supported by UNDP have devised ways to construct rural housing units out of locally available materials, many of which were previously discarded as worthless, so that homes can now be built by community construction teams at a fraction of their former costs. This is but one evidence that indigenous and low-cost technology is available and is workable in many aspects of human settlement work. I am proud of the work that UNDP is currently supporting to advance this concept. I hope that governments will draw upon the development program in all areas in which we can contribute. From the extensive experience of the United Nations Development Program with regional institutions and centers of many kinds, I would, of course, urge maximum efforts to build any needed regional capacities upon existing national institutions. I hope, too, that the close and rationalized linkages will be invoked between the proposed information referral and sub-regional recruitment system and UNDP's special efforts to advance technical cooperation among developing countries. Settlements development work will depend in the first instance on how well its requirements and implications are anticipated and built into all relevant development programs and projects. But with regard to the funding of direct human settlements projects themselves, I need not elaborate on the basic principles governing the use of most of UNDP's project funds. That is to say that the selection of priorities lies with each government. The extent to which a larger proportion of resources may go to human settlements activities will depend almost entirely upon governmental decisions and contributions which represent a genuine addition to the total pool of resources available for development. With Habitat, thank you, sir. One sentence and I shall conclude and urge that my colleagues read my statement. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank you very much. The Administrator of the United Nations Development Program. I would like to particularly thank those of you who have spoken this morning for respecting the time limits and those who have cooperated in some technical malfunctions. The result of this is, though, that we have completed our morning proceedings in good time, that this will make certain that all those who wish to speak, or most of those who wish to speak at least, will have that opportunity. We now see it will be possible to add more speakers in the morning, or at least one more, perhaps two, and after our experience this morning in which you all cooperated, I think we can move to a position where we can accommodate the greatest possible number of people. So I wish to thank you for your cooperation and understanding, because it has been a little difficult with the electronic gadgetry. I would like to call upon the Rapporteur General of the conference, Mr. Ciborowski, who has some words for us.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like only to invite warmly the distinguished delegates. They will take floor today in the afternoon and on the next days of our debate to deliver, when possible, one copy of their message in advance of taking the floor for their intervention to the Rapporteur. This will facilitate very much our sometimes hectic work and will assure that we will not forget or omit anything of the most important components of your statement. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Ciborowski. And Mr. Kudar, the Secretary of the Conference, also has some announcements to make.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the first speaker this afternoon will be the distinguished delegate of Spain. I wish to announce that his statement will include a film statement by His Majesty the King of Spain. A further announcement, sir. the General Committee will meet tomorrow morning, Wednesday, the 2nd of June, at 8:45 a.m. and not 9 o'clock as we have announced in today's journal, in Conference Room C, or is called Pacific Ballroom, at the Hotel Vancouver. As the conference is aware, the General Committee consists of the President, the 33 Vice Presidents, the Rapporteur General, and the Chairman of the 3 committees, Committee 1, 2, and 3. We have been asked about facilities concerning some small caucus or regional meetings. I can inform that a limited number of small meeting rooms for informal consultations are available on the 6th and 7th floor of the big building in Georgia Street. Reservations for those rooms can be made by telephoning 689-6382. I'm repeating, sir. Reservations for the small caucus room for informal consultations can be booked in big building by telephoning the number 689-6382. Mrs. Dorothy McDonough. And finally, sir, after the adjournment of the plenary this evening, Mrs. Barbara Wall will give a lecture and in this hall after the plenary meeting. The title of this lecture is The Home of Man, What Nations in the International Community Must Do. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Kedar. This session is now adjourned. Good.